Hello and welcome to the Stronghold Digital Mining Daily Update. Today is Friday, January 19th, 2024. Let's do something a little bit different. Let's take a careful look at the Stronghold Digital Mining financial statements. More specifically, I want to go back in time and chart the changes in expenses such as, for example, fuel, operations and maintenance, general and administrative. We're going to focus on those three core expenses. And what we're going to do is we're going to start probably as far back as Q1 2022. The reason I'm choosing Q1 is because Panther Creek was acquired late in 2021. So by focusing on Q1 2022, what we're essentially doing is really including all of the relevant fuel, O&M, and G&A expenses that would include the Panther Creek acquisition. So I think it's a more complete picture of those expenses. So we're going to start in the first quarter of 2022, and then we're going to, slowly but surely work our way through every single quarter up until essentially Q3 2023, which is the last quarterly update that we have available to us. So we're going to go ahead and switch views. You might the sound might be a little bit different, but I'm going to try to normalize the sound so it's not too different. But let's go ahead and dive into these numbers and take a look at what they look like. So depending on how you're choosing to view this broadcast, the information on the screen may or may not be readily visible. So out of an abundance of caution, I'm going to verbalize much of the information that we're talking about simply so that there's clarity about what we're talking about. So we're going to begin with the first quarter of 2022. Now, I've elected to include interest payments as part of this conversation. And the reason why is because interest payments, along with fuel expenses, along with operations and maintenance expenses, along with general and administrative expenses, are all expenses that require money to leave the proverbial bank account. These are not accounting expenses, or non-cash expenses. These types of expenses require money to leave the account. So this is a big deal. So for Q1 2022, total expenses of $34.1 million. Q2, second quarter 2022, total expenses $40.6 million. Third quarter 2022, total expenses of $42.7 million. Fourth quarter 2022, total expenses of $26.5 million. Bearing in mind that the expenses that we're talking about when we talk about total expenses, it's really just fuel, O&M, G&A, and interest. Those four mission-critical categories. Now, the highest amount of money that we paid out in those types of expenses during 2022 was during the third quarter. We peaked at $42.7 million. The $26.5 million that we incurred in the way of expenses for those four categories during the fourth quarter of 2022 really marked a turning point. Once we get into the first quarter of 2023, total expenses $26.7 million. Second quarter 2023, $27.7 million. Third quarter 2023, $24.5 million. Now, the dilemma that we've experienced during much of 2023 is that our revenue simply wasn't as robust as it was during 2022. For example, if we were to pair the amount of revenue that we generated in the second quarter of 2022, that amounts to $29.1 million. If we were to pair that revenue with our expenses of the third quarter of 2023 of $24.5 million, we'd have more than just an adjusted EBITDA cash flow positive type of situation. We'd have an actual profit. Now, there would still be a variety of other accounting expenses that might likely not actually result in like a real net profit from an accounting perspective. But in terms of saying how much was our revenue and then what kind of real expenses, like the expenses whereby money left our account, what were our real expenses? And you do that math, you can already start to see that with more revenue, our expenses are in a position to actually allow us to generate what I would describe as more of a legitimate profit. Now, when we think about the type of revenue that's been revealed through our Bitcoin mining production figures, which also talk about monthly revenue, and we look at October, November, and December of 2023, which would represent the fourth quarter of the year, I think there's a reasonable chance that we might find ourselves very close to generating that type of what I'd describe as a real profit. Now, bearing in mind there's an additional roughly $1.5 million in expenses that were incurred as a result of some issues at Scrubgrass and to some extent some issues at Panther Creek. Bearing that in mind, the fact remains that we appear to be in a position whereby if revenue were to exceed $27 million, I think there is a really, really good chance that we'd experience what again I'll describe as something more akin to a real profit. The reason why I say that is because looking at our expenses over the past 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 quarters, we're starting to see a situation where 26.5, that would have been fourth quarter 2022. 26.7, that's the first quarter 2023. 27.7, that's second quarter 2023. 24.5, that's the third quarter of 2023. We're starting to see a pattern whereby our expenses, and again, these are not all of our expenses from an accounting perspective, but really just focusing on fuel, O&M, G&A, and interest. Those 4 categories of expenses have really started to, perhaps one could argue, normalize at around, say, roughly between 24.5 million and perhaps 27.7 million. There's something of a range there. Yes, there are going to inevitably sometimes be unexpected circumstances, such as what took place at Scrubgrass and at Panther Creek. That is to be expected to some extent. But what we are seeing is a situation where we are very, very far away from some of those more heavy-handed expenses which we experienced in the early parts of 2022. If we can see revenue really start to ramp up, perhaps $30 million in revenue for a quarter, perhaps $35 million in revenue for a quarter, and we can see our expenses be in the realm of 24 to roughly say 26 to maybe even $27 million, we're starting to see a situation emerge whereby a very, very compelling case could be made that we are actually generating what I would describe as something more akin to a profit. And I think the data that is on the screen, and again, you may or may not be able to really see this depending on what type of device you're viewing this broadcast, but based on this data, I think the real focus has to be on revenue that can be, say, roughly $30 million or higher. With that type of situation in place, we are set up to do very well insofar as generating more revenue than our expenses. The trend with regard to expenses seems to be somewhat stable, but hopefully with continued focus and effort, the expense numbers can continue to move in a lower direction. Okay, so I hope you found that to be relatively interesting and relatively informative. I find that type of exercise really, really interesting because I think it helps demonstrate the trajectory and the progress that we're making with regard to these expenses. Okay, my friend, with all of that said, let's stay positive, let's be great, let's try to have a great weekend, and we'll see each other again on Monday.